Honourable Simon Watts.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Taxation Principles Reporting Repeal Bill be now read a third time. Madam Speaker, honourable members, I thank you for your time in considering this bill under urgency. As we are under urgency, I will provide a very brief recap of the bill that we are considering today. The Taxation Principles Reporting Act Repeal Bill does what the name implies. It has a single purpose, and once that purpose has been fulfilled, it writes itself out of the history books by repealing itself. But humble and self-fulfilling as it is a very useful bill with some noble objectives. It frees future governments from the restrictive descriptions of tax principles set out in the Act and allows them to describe for themselves what they see as a good tax system. It allows them to pursue the tax policies they were elected to carry out. It is saving taxpayers money and compliance costs by stopping them from having to provide unnecessary information to Inland Revenue. And it will stop Inland Revenue from having to devote precious resources to preparing reports on the tax system in relation to certain tax principles. Those resources could and should be better used, including actually collecting tax. This, then, is a very worthwhile bill. I would like to thank the tax policy officials and legislative drafter for all their work in preparing this bill so quickly. Mr Speaker, I commend the Taxation Principles Reporting Act Repeal Bill to the House.
Well done. The Honourable Dr Deborah Russell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This week, under urgency, we have had fair pay agreements taken away. We have had 90-day trials put back in place. We have had the clean car discount taken away. The government has not proposed any new or original policies. It has not come with anything positive to this House. Instead, it has taken away, removed, repealed, destroyed. That's their agenda. That's their agenda. It's all they've got. And now they've done it on this bill. This bill takes away the Tax Principles Reporting Act, an act which would simply have given us more information about our tax system so that as citizens we can make good judgments. You know, the previous speaker, the Minister, said that the descriptors were restrictive, that governments should be allowed to set principles for themselves. That's an astonishing thing to say. And that would free governments to set their own tax policies. Let's work through that. Governments are still, always have been free to set their own tax policies. What this bill would have done would have enabled some judgments to be made about those tax policies using descriptors that are long established and widely agreed as the appropriate descriptors and appropriate principles to use for assessing a tax system. But this government is too scared to allow that to happen. It is a real shame that this bill is going through. Mr Speaker, I'm going to end with a quote from the submissions on the original bill from a submitter who actually said this would be a good policy to pursue. This submitter said, I'm going to reveal the name at the end, this is a surprise for the end of the year. The organisation, quote, has a keen interest in tax policy, including a comprehensive submission to the 2018-19 tax review, as well as submissions and feedback to Inland Revenue on more technical consultations on the area. This submitter supports the concept of increased information about the operation of the tax system and reporting of tax information against core taxation principles. We also broadly agree with the list of 7 principles listed in Schedule 1 of the bill. This submitter agreed with the Tax Principles Reporting Act. The chair of that submitter is now in this House as an ACT MP. Federated Farmers thought this was good policy, and that government has rejected it. What a sad note on which to end the year.
I call Chloe Swarbrick.
Mr Speaker, I just wanted to continue in the vein of the Honourable Dr Deborah Russell and say that it's gutting that this is where we end the year in the House. Merry Christmas to the workers who have had their opportunity to engage in sector-based bargaining. stripped away from them, again, under urgency, oftentimes in the dead of night without the opportunity for meaningful consultation or engagement at Select Committee. Merry Christmas to the workers who will now be going into their new jobs with the opportunity to be fired at will under the first 90 days. Merry Christmas to the climate, which will be, facing more oil and gas poured on the climate crisis. Merry Christmas to the climate, with the clean car discount being repealed, one of the most successful climate change policies that governments have seen in decades, without any commensurate policy put forward to replace it. Merry Christmas as well to renters who, under this government, will potentially see their rents skyrocket between 15 to 20% based on estimations from the likes of economists Bernard Hickey, based on this government's work program to remove and roll back interest deductibility rules and otherwise. Mr. Speaker, it is abundantly clear that the government currently bollocking at me has absolutely no vision, because what we have seen over the past 2 weeks is that they have instead simply fired up the shredder. There is no creativity, no meaningful policy pathway that we have seen to build an Aotearoa New Zealand that is inclusive, that is equitable, and that ultimately provides that pathway for the upholding of people and the planet. So, Mr. Speaker, to the bill, which we haven't had any real meaningful opportunity to talk about. But given that the government actually engaged no external submitters, no external stakeholders, despite accusing the former government of undertaking no meaningful engagement, and then obviously completely bypass the Select Committee process by which we may have had a more meaningful and informed opportunity to shape up this legislation into something that any of us could be proud of. This bill, as has oftentimes been said throughout all stages, actually doesn't change our tax system. It doesn't fix the inequities that have been long baked in, as well elucidated in the High Wealth Individuals report from IRD with subsidiary papers from Treasury at the beginning of this year. Mr. Speaker, this is a really important and fundamental point because it leaves us with the state of the economy as we presently have it. And I'll bring it back to this graph from Max Rashbrook, which obviously members of the opposition would prefer I put down in the same way that they'd like to bin the report, which officials have largely worked on. Just for those following along at home, this is really, really important to outline here. This is based on substantive survey data, the distribution of wealth that New Zealanders believe would be ideal. It looks equitable. It looks as though everybody has the opportunity to start at the same point in the starting line. The second bar, Mr. Speaker, is what New Zealanders think that the distribution of wealth in Aotearoa New Zealand is. And you can see a substantive divergence there. New Zealanders actually do assume that right now we do have an unfair and inequitable distribution of wealth that is far from what they think that it is, or rather what they believe it is ideal to be. But then, Mr. Speaker, we get to the third point of the graph around what it actually is. And there you can see where the disproportionate wealth and power in Aotearoa New Zealand is held. And that is the core point that we are debating today, Mr. Speaker, because that wealth aggregation doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs as a result of a tax system which many New Zealanders, per that graph, assume is unfair. And as the High Wealth Individuals report from the Inland Revenue Department told us was unfair, because we see that the top 311 families in this country pay an effective tax rate less than half of that of the average New Zealander. And I dare members of the ACT Party who are presently heckling about how those 311 families worked hard to tell us that the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders who hold less wealth than those 311 families combined, I dare you to tell those New Zealanders that they did not work hard. Because in fact what we see is that our tax system, as again borne out in those subsidiary papers from Treasury on that IRD report, those New Zealanders do work hard, but that we have a tax system that disproportionately taxes work over wealth. And that puts us as an outlier in the OECD. We are one of the only countries that we compare ourselves to, Mr. Speaker, that does not have a capital gains tax, a stamp duty tax, a wealth tax, or any form of taxation that is meaningfully targeted to address those inequities. Mr. Speaker, the other point on this bill is that this report is already done. And this was largely canvassed throughout other parts and debates in this bill, because we know that under the statute, as it currently sits actually, until we get to the point of this bill being passed under urgency in the next hour or so, under the law as it currently sits on our statute books, IRD are required to publish a report on the 31st of December. And as I've said, during the first reading and the second reading in Committee of the Whole, and it bears out putting on the Hansard once again, that is 10 days from now. In those 10 days, we have 2 public holidays in the form of Christmas and Boxing Day. We also have 2 weekend days. That takes away 4 days. That gives us ostensibly 6 working days. But we know that IRD officials, as with most public servants and white-collar workers across this country, are probably on holiday from tomorrow. And the inevitable logical conclusion that brings us to, Mr. Speaker, is that this report is done. And that then begs the question of why the government is keen to bin it. Because, Mr. Speaker, we've been told that the reason that we are rushing this through under urgency today and through midnight last night is because they need to get it done before the 31st of December, when that bill is due to be published. And my question is to members of the government is, what are you so scared of? Because we heard from the Minister during Committee of the Whole House, and actually as reflected in the regulatory impact statement from his officials, that there is an intention to actually increase the level of reporting within IRD on the efficacy of our tax system. So, Mr. Speaker, there is still an intention to do some form of ambiguous reporting, which we're not quite sure is going to look like, yet we're repealing this principles-based legislation based on, again, and I take here from our independent advisor on the bill, who said, and I quote, and this is Sir Rob McLeod, not somebody who I don't think anybody in this House could allege of being ideologically driven. He said, and I quote, "I would omit the descriptors because the meaning of each design principle is sufficiently well understood on their own." So, Mr. Speaker, we're left with a situation with a report which is due to come out in 10 days under the law as it currently sits on our books, a minister who says that we're doing this in order to reduce waste of resources, but those resources are already spent. And it bears, again, worth putting on the record that those resources are 2.5 FTE, i.e. 0.06% of all of the FTE that operate within the Inland Revenue Department, and a minister that is saying that he intends to continue doing some form of reporting which we have no meaningful clarity over. So we should have, and we could have had a process if the government had decided to let this report come out, as it, again, still to this point is due to in the next 10 days, where they could have said, hey, look, New Zealand, here's the issues that we have with the format of this bill as it is currently, with the format of this reporting as it has been put out. But we're not going to be able to have that meaningful debate because in the dark of the night, this government has decided to shred that legislation, pushing through midnight and urgency last night. And, Mr. Speaker, it really bears pointing out again that this is a government who has utilised rhetoric such as the importance of data and evidence, but is deciding to shred a framework which would have enabled us to have precisely that. Mr. Speaker, we don't live in a game of Monopoly. We live in a democracy where, when we are informed by evidence and data, we have the opportunity to make informed decisions about the economy that we want to live in. Because the question for the government and for the opposition, and indeed for our parliament, should be what kind of economy do we want to build? Because it isn't handed down to us on concrete tablets from a deity in the sky. It is a man-made concept with structures, rules and regulations that we put in place to try and achieve outcomes that we put down on paper in these laws. And, Mr. Speaker, I just got to say, having heard the inconsistencies logically in the speech from the throne a few weeks ago, where this government was talking about the want to have more affordable housing while doing policies, putting forward policy prescriptions that they know demonstrably will do the opposite of that, while saying that they want to have a higher wage economy, while doing the opposite of what Australia does with a fairer tax system, a capital gains tax and sector-based bargaining, which they repealed under urgency. This government really has us all questioning what their priorities are and who they serve. We oppose this bill.